You think you know the story of Solomon. You've read the scriptures, heard the wisdom, imagined the golden temple rising in Jerusalem. But there's a chapter they don't talk about. A chapter the heavens remembered, and the hells waited for. Before we begin, subscribe to this channel and activate the bell. Not just because it helps us, but because if this message reaches your soul, you were meant to hear it. Let's begin. The silence of God is not absence. It's a sentence waiting to be understood. When Solomon walked in favor, he heard divine whispers in dreams and fire on the altar. But favor, once misunderstood, became entitlement. He stopped listening and started calculating. The heavens didn't shout, they simply went quiet. And in that quiet, demons began to whisper, one by one. Whispering not in foreign tongues, but in familiar longings, curiosity, power, control. That's how the gate opened. Not with a scream, but with a sigh. The people rejoiced outside. The temple rose, stones stacked like promises. Priests sang. Nations sent gold. It all looked holy. But inside, behind the veil, something cracked. Not with thunder, but with decision. Solomon began to ask questions no prophet dared to ask. Not questions of worship, questions of domination. He wanted to name what God had sealed. He wanted to understand what heaven had warned him to fear. And when a man stops trembling before the sacred, the profane slips in dressed like revelation. He wore the ring not with reverence but with ownership. It sparkled on his hand while his soul grew dim. The ring was once a gift, but a gift without awe becomes a weapon. One demon answered. Then, another. They bowed, yes, but not in surrender. In strategy. They knew he believed he was in control. That belief was the open door. And Solomon, once a son of David, became a host to shadows. Every name he wrote down was a seed. Every interrogation was a prayer redirected to the wrong altar. And yet heaven did not strike. That's the part we struggle with. Why didn't God stop him? Why didn't fire fall? Because before judgment comes mercy. Before the sword comes silence. And silence is not passive. It is patient, watching, measuring, waiting for the man to walk just far enough that he cannot deny he left. That's where Solomon was heading. And the one who watched from above was not passive. Michael stood ready, not to plead, to execute. You think rebellion looks like chaos, but in the palace of Solomon it looked like excellence. Sacred architecture, flawless ceremonies, but the spirit had already left. Quietly, like a guest who knows they are no longer welcome. While Solomon mapped the hierarchies of demons, the heavens watched their king forget his first love. He wasn't a monster. He was a man too curious, too confident, and too alone in his brilliance. That's what made it dangerous. The first time Michael descended, there was no thunder, no flame, just presence, pure, absolute presence. The air changed, the ring shook, the demons froze. They recognized him before Solomon did. Because darkness knows authority, even when man forgets. Michael walked through corridors gilded in pride. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Judgment doesn't require explanation, just permission, and heaven had just given it. But still, there was grace. Michael didn't strike. He watched, because even the mightiest fall deserves a moment of recognition. Solomon met his gaze, and in that moment, everything he'd built with brilliance felt suddenly hollow. He still wore the crown, but inside, he was trembling. That was the true war, not between angel and demon, between the man Solomon had been and the shadow he had become. And that war had just reached its climax. He no longer heard God in the night, only voices, not loud, not terrifying, just persistent. They came in dreams, in symbols, in the breath of his foreign wives. Not idols carved in stone, but ideas carved in his soul. The desire to know what was hidden, what God had not revealed. That desire became his altar. Every ritual was wrapped in gold, but soaked in compromise. He didn't shout to the heavens. He whispered to the dark, and it whispered back. The demon Ornias didn't scream. He didn't rage. He lamented, a sorrowful tone that disarmed Solomon's suspicion. He fed off the energy of the youth. Quiet, unnoticed. That was the entry point. Subtle. Solomon didn't reject him. He questioned him, forced him to speak. And what he revealed shattered the illusion. There were more, not a few, 72, each with a name, each with an assignment, each with a past chained in rebellion and now unchained by a king's ambition. The scribes recorded everything: names, powers, symbols, weaknesses. Solomon wasn't protecting Israel anymore. He was building a map of the abyss, cataloging spirits of sickness, division, false religion, manipulation, all dressed in wisdom. None looked grotesque. They looked enlightening. That was the trick. The most dangerous lies wear truth like a robe. And Solomon, thinking he was mastering them, was only deepening their grip. Michael knew. He watched. That's what made it heavy. When heaven waits, it isn't indifferent. It's exact. He waited not for Solomon's fall, but for the moment he could no longer justify the climb. Judgment must always come after clarity, so that no one can say, "I didn't know." And Solomon knew. The weight of the ring, the burning behind the eyes, the restlessness in the night. It wasn't ignorance. It was rebellion wearing the mask of intelligence. And then came Beelzebub, not like the others. He didn't bow. He didn't cry. He smiled, a challenge in his stare. Solomon tried the ring, but the air shifted. Walls trembled. For the first time, the king felt powerless. Beelzebub didn't need to deceive. He offered power, dominion, control over death itself, not through violence but surrender, not in word, but in soul. And Solomon began to bend, not with his knees, but with his will. The altar still burned, the music still played, the priests still danced. But Solomon's heart had migrated. He didn't weep in worship. He recited formulas. His prayers were not communion. They were control. And while he played the role of king, inside he was enslaved to a gift he no longer ruled. The ring no longer shimmered. It burned. It didn't empower. It imprisoned. That is the curse of a divine gift used outside of divine fear. And the demons noticed. Their obedience waned. Lies returned. Mockery began. They no longer feared Solomon. They tolerated him, manipulated him. The man who once spoke with angels now debated with shadows. His soul didn't collapse in a day. It cracked line by line. Not with screams, with silence. Because judgment doesn't shout. It waits. And when it arrives, it doesn't ask permission. It just executes. The palace no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was a lab of darkness. In secret chambers, Solomon wrote symbols he once would have burned. He traced patterns, memorized incantations, listened to whispers from mouths no prophet of Israel would dare entertain. And still the temple rose outside, majestic, holy, deceiving. The same hands that offered incense to God were offering parchment to demons. It wasn't just a mixture, it was contamination. And nobody saw it, except heaven and Michael. One night, it happened. In a hidden corridor, Solomon felt it, a presence he hadn't felt since Gibeon. But this wasn't warm. It wasn't tender. It was absolute. It didn't speak. It didn't ask. It stood. Michael had descended, and the ring on Solomon's hand shook not from fear, but from recognition. The demons knew. The air thickened. The glory that once filled Solomon's dreams now stood in judgment before him, and all he could do was breathe and tremble. Still, Michael didn't strike. He simply existed, and his existence judged everything. That's the thing about holiness. It doesn't need to accuse. It reveals. And when it reveals, all pretense collapses. Solomon said nothing. He couldn't, because deep down, he knew. He had not been betrayed. He had betrayed, not with violence, but with obsession. He no longer wanted the God of revelation. He wanted the secrets God had sealed away. And then came the unraveling. One ritual, one slip. The ring vanished, lost, stolen, removed. No one knows how, but without it, the illusion shattered. The demons surged. Asmodeus rose. According to ancient records, he took the throne. Disguised as Solomon, the king of Israel was cast out, not in war, but in shame. A servant, a wanderer, stripped of honor. Not because of enemies, but because of pride. The fall wasn't external, it was internal. But mercy doesn't expire. In the wilderness, broken and anonymous, Solomon found the ring again. inside a fish, not by luck, by grace. It wasn't the ring that mattered. It was the humility, the shattered pride, the burned ego. And when he returned, he didn't come back to dominate. He came to remember. The voice in Gibeon, the dream that once called him son. And then, Michael returned. But this time, not to judge, to protect. The demons scattered. The judgment had been fulfilled. What began as curiosity had ended in exposure. But exposure is not the end. It's the threshold. The message remained. You cannot mix the sacred and the profane without consequence. You may build your temple. You may impress the crowds. But heaven sees the altar. And if the altar is contaminated, the whole kingdom trembles, even if no one else sees it. This story was not about demons. It was about decisions. Not about hell's noise, but about heaven's silence. The silence that waits for a heart to break. That waits for a king to become a servant. That waits for the name of Michael to be whispered again. Not in fear, but in hope. Because when he descends, it's not always to strike. Sometimes, it's to restore. I'm Oliver, and I share these truths not just as stories, but as echoes of what heaven still sees, and what your spirit might already feel. If something in you stirred today, don't let it fade. Subscribe to the channel, and follow Jesus with everything you are. What you build in secret shapes what you carry in the light. Guard your altar, purify it. And if you've fallen, know this. Restoration is always one whisper away. Stay close. We walk this path together.